Hello and welcome to Lesson 3. Lesson 3 on psychological problems, and more specifically we are going to look today at what is depression. So we're going to be focusing on depression today. Now it's really important to note that there are two types of depression, both unipolar depression and bipolar. Unipolar depression is also known as clinical depression or depression. And generally, people with depression have a continuously low mood and a complete loss of enjoyment and energy. Uni, however, comes from the Latin and means one. Someone with unipolar depression only experience a change of mood in one direction, and that is low. The character, for example, Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh, could be a perfect example of somebody with that particular mental health problem, in that they are suffering from a unipolar condition, a mood or a disorder that causes the individual just to feel constantly low all the time and lethargic, and it's almost like the enjoyment of life is sucked out of that individual, and that very much is the type of depression that is known as unipolar depression. The other type of depression, actually, if I may just go back very briefly, unipolar depression I think is often the form of depression which is strongly associated with the characteristic of mainstream depression, what people understand the depression to look a bit like. Whereas bipolar depression, not really, because just like somebody suffering unipolar, yes, you have those troughs, you have those real low points, but those low points can actually be significantly lower than somebody suffering with unipolar. Now, the word bi comes from Latin and it means two. Someone with bipolar depression, therefore, experiences two types of mood. And as we have already alluded to, one mood is absolute despair. And to the extent that actually people who suffer from bipolar depression will sometimes, frequently, depends upon the case, the individual will have suicidal thoughts. The other end of bipolar depression is mania, where the individual will experience bursts of almost not euphoria, but bursts of energy where they will act in a way which almost perhaps might be deemed as irrational by other members of society. So it's bipolar depression, to put I suppose, to give you a shorter summary, bipolar depression, a mood disorder that causes an individual's mood and energy and activity levels to fluctuate or to change from one extreme to the other. And this is why it's called bipolar, because as I say, it ultimately means two. Now, if you were to visit your GP and because you were concerned perhaps that you weren't just sad, but you were suffering some form of sadness, but actually you genuinely thought that you had depression, as a rule of thumb, the GP would be asking how long these symptoms were manifesting themselves. Now, the symptoms we'll come to in a second. The rule of thumb is that if it's been consistent for about 3 months, then the doctor will take those conditions. They would take it seriously anyway, but they would that would be, as a rule, what they would be looking for. They would be looking for these symptoms to really have been quite pronounced for a prolonged period, i.e. 3 months. Now, by diagnosing the unipolar depression, the World Health Organization, or the International Classification of Disease, has given 10 ways for a GP to actually know whether the patient in question is actually suffering from depression. The list is as followed. The first 5 I'll go through quite deliberately. Okay, so the International Classification of Disease is given that low mood, reduced energy and activity levels, changes to sleep patterns, changes to appetite levels, and decreased self-confidence. Okay, now those 5, which which type of depression would you categorize, if you had to, would you categorize those 5 characteristics in? Would you say, well, that individual who presents those characteristics, is that perhaps a marker of uni depression or bipolar depression? And the answer to that, of course, would be the former. It would be a unipolar. It's a constant low mood, isn't it? And we've already talked about the fact that uni comes from the Latin and means one. However, the subsequent 5 of the 10 are perhaps are a little bit different. Let's have a look. So we got decreased self-confidence, lack of interest and enjoyment, reduced concentration and focus, feelings of guilt and worthlessness. Now that worthlessness and guilt could be quite pronounced in some, and negative thoughts about the future, and finally number 10 is suicidal thoughts. Now, if clearly you had a patient that was actually was presenting those kind of symptoms, you may lean more towards diagnosing somebody having bipolar. Now, what you certainly would not do is you certainly wouldn't self-diagnose, because it is subjective and you cannot possibly do that to yourself. And neither would you get a friend, because whilst it might be subjective, as we've mentioned, we are just simply not qualified to make such huge decisions about our health. And obviously, if one is ever concerned about these things, you clearly go to professionals. So what I'd like you to do, guys, is I'd like you to make sure that you visit on Show My Homework pages 174 to 175. Okay, and I'd really like you to do the activities, copy the key terms on that page, and you'll find that document on, as ever, Show My Homework.